This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Thanks a million, Lorcan. Good afternoon, everybody. Those joining us here in person and indeed those online, you're very warmly welcomed to this event. My name is Barry Colfer. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute. Today, we're going to discuss the resurgence of torture, new realities in international relations through a fireside chat with Alice Edwards. In a moment, Keelan Gallagher, KC, is going to do the proper introduction, but just to say, we're so pleased that you're here. Very briefly, Alice Edwards is the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, human or degrading treatment or punishment. And Keelan Gallagher, KC, it's equally known to many of you as a leading international human rights lawyer and has acted in many landmark cases in Europe and internationally. We're really fortunate that you're here, and just thanks very much for being with us. I have 2 or 3 things to say just as regards housekeeping. The format for the discussion today, we're very pleased, is going to be a fireside chat. So the speakers will interact for maybe 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity to engage via questions and answers. Those who are here in front of me, just raise your hand in the conventional way and a microphone will come to you. And those online, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. And please do take the time to interact. The discussion here is on the record, and I'm very much looking forward to it. At this juncture, I'll hand over to you, Keelan, to do the proper introductions. Thanks again.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much to the Institute for having us today. It's a privilege to be moderating this unseasonally named fireside chat with Dr. Alice Edwards, a remarkable woman. We're very lucky to have her here. So as you'll hear, she is quite literally one of the busiest women in the world, given her role. Now, I'm very conscious that the original fireside chats in the 1930s with Roosevelt did involve people listening on the radio in their homes. And I'm conscious that as well as the people in the room, we've got a lot of people joining us online. So you're all very welcome. And I hope we can participate as much as possible when we get to the Q&A part. Just to briefly introduce Dr. Edwards, I could take up the full hour explaining her achievements, but I wanted to give you a brief flavor. She's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture. She's the first woman to hold the mandate in its 40-year history. And she has been doing the role for 4 years, and that ends next month in July. Her work bridges legal innovation and real-world impact. And across nearly 3 decades in her work, she's shaped global standards while working directly with governments, institutions, and affected communities to drive reform. She's documented human rights violations, advocated for justice, rehabilitation, and peace on behalf of victims and survivors in major wars, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, Mozambique, Russia, Ukraine, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Palestine, and Israel. She's widely recognized, quite rightly, as a thought leader in international affairs. She's really been transformative, and she's transformed how the world views and understands torture, including advancing the recognition of rape and sexual violence and hostage taking as forms of torture. It's been really transformative, vitally important work. And previous to this 4 years, she served as the chief legal advisor at the UN Refugee Agency. That was for 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, critical years when she was there. She led the Inter-Governmental Convention Against Torture initiative for 5 years, from 2016 to 2021, supporting states to ratify the convention, strengthen implementation of international law. And unsurprisingly, given that background, won't surprise you to hear that in 2024, she was nominated for Australian of the Year. So we're remarkably lucky to have her here. So let me jump right into it. In the 4 years that you've served as United Nations Special Rapporteur, I've just mentioned that. Could you just help those in the audience who are unfamiliar with the role? What does the mandate entail?
Great. First of all, thank you very much, Keelan, for agreeing to have this hot summer's day chat with me, and also, of course, to the Institute for putting this on. The role is multifaceted, and in fact, I've been called the chief investigator on torture. I've been called the watchdog on torture. The Independent likes to call me the torture czar, which is very strange. But in essence, my main role is actually to provide advice to the member states of the Human Rights Council in Geneva that appointed me. And that is ordinarily through report writing on specific issues that are going on around the world or potentially gaps in the international framework. A second function is to carry out fact-finding investigations into countries Regrettably, with the UN financial crisis, that has been reduced from 2, which was already an inadequate number when you consider how many countries around the world have challenges of torture, to only 1 per year. And those country visits I see as really central to being able to do the job properly, and also the most beneficial to states, because you get to see things on the ground, you get to see them yourselves, and you get to discuss with the main interlocutors. And the third is to deal with the whole series of allegations that are brought to the attention of the mandate through individuals, through their lawyers, through NGOs, through other advocates, including sometimes states, on people that are either at risk of torture or who are being subjected to torture. And that is also a very important function of the mandate.
So it's breathtakingly broad, what you've just described there. I know the answer to this. Can you tell people if the role is full-time?
The role is technically part-time and unpaid. Untechnically, it is unpaid. It is in a way an honorary position. The unpaid nature of it is to ensure the independence and impartiality of the mandate, so that you are not receiving any money from any external sources where you may find yourself in a position of being under pressure or not being able to do your job independently. And the independence is also independent from the United Nations, which is often forgotten. We're there, in my view, to put forward new and different perspectives. If member states wanted a position of the United Nations, they can ask the United Nations. This is trying to get people with certain expertise, certain areas of experience to bring new issues and new solutions to the table.
Yeah. And can you help us about the resourcing that you've got? What staffing resource do you have?
I have one human rights officer provided by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I did have for 1 year a Swiss junior professional officer, and I have found resources for some external support. I have pro bono law firm assistance, which has been, absolutely indispensable. I have not worked for the full 4 years. It is such an intense position that I gave up my teaching at Oxford because I couldn't really do the job properly, and I considered, well, I'm only going to do this once. I'm only going to be the Special Rapporteur once, and it really requires my full attention. Yeah. But it's a tough gig to have, and it does limit the pool of people that are, for all of the Special Rapporteurs, who are available to do these roles.
Absolutely. So your tortures are, whatever you want to call it, for the world at large, including a whole range of individual complaints which may be brought to you, and dealing with those policy issues, and dealing with the country visits. And it's you, unpaid, technically part-time, and 1 staff member.
Yes.
Okay, well, it's astonishing, really, isn't it? So anyone who's making a complaint, it's just worth knowing that's the framework within which you're making complaint here. So I want to turn to the state of the prohibition now. And the prohibition on torture is, of course, often described as absolute, but torture, of course, persists. In your view, very broad question, is the problem one of law, political will, accountability, a combination of those things, or something else?
Look, I think we're in a strange place at the moment. I think we are living through an era of volatility, and I think we need to get familiar with this era of uncertainty and volatility. I predict it is going to last for decades. We're living in a world where multilateralism is more and more complicated, and there are more allegiances going on. So it's no longer also predictable in that domain who's going to support whom. Thankfully, the absolute prohibition on torture is considered jus cogens, an erga omnes norm. Now there are 176 states parties to the Convention Against Torture. In my previous role, I was supporting and brought on board 15 new countries in a span of 5 years, which actually moved the Convention Against Torture from being one of the lowest ratified to now having surpassed, in fact, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Of course, there are some major players that remain outside the convention, including India, Myanmar, Iran, etc. But China, the United States, Russia, all parties to the convention and long-standing parties. So it's not a problem of norms per se. There are still some gaps, and I've been working on different areas, and we can go into those. But it's really a question of political will. The amount of armed conflicts that are going on in the world, the International Committee of the Red Cross says there are 120 going on simultaneously, means that torture is escalating because conflicts are escalating, and that correlation between perpetration of torture and other inhuman acts against individuals, against people perceived as the other, people perceived as the enemy, is growing alongside the armed conflicts. And then, I mean, on the other side, I think we need to also recognize there's never been a golden era of implementation of human rights. So to kind of be a bit, pragmatic about where we started from and where we're going to. We've made enormous progress in the last 80 years. And in my experience, there is a whole group of states from, Western states, some developing democratic states, some states in transition, a whole parcel of states that actually have challenges but are working conscientiously to try and alleviate those challenges. And then I have my torture hit list, which is unfortunately growing, of countries where there is impunity, where there are cover-ups, where torture is normalized, where it is brazen, etc. So kind of, I think we shouldn't forget about the parcel of countries that are attempting to reform their prisons, who've been doing different trainings on their police, have stopped coercive interviews, etc. Because they are an important influence on the others, and we don't hear enough also about them. Every year they report to me at the Human Rights Council, and I've been surprised how a report goes back to capital, they send it to the right institutions, and then some random country that hasn't come into my vision will suddenly report on what they've done and the challenges that they have. So, we're it's 195 member and observer states of the United Nations. There are lots of differences between the countries, but it's not all negative. Of course, the headlines are negative, and of course, if you are at risk of torture or other ill treatment, or you've been subjected to it, it is a terrible, terrible thing. So it's right that we focus on the countries that haven't done and are not doing what they're supposed to do. And that's also really important, and it's the main part of the role as well.
Yeah, and just interesting what you say there about your torture hit list. Sorry, we're being swatted by flies here. Seagulls outside and then flies in here. It's all very seasonal and not very far side, it's got to be said. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the torture hit list. I mean, in my work just with victims of torture, one of the things which always surprises me is some of the countries which I know are routine users of torture, and there's a real mismatch between what I know the reality is from my clients and from seeing the scars and knowing what they go through, and then the international perception with them being presented in quite a different way. Is that something you see too, that mismatch?
Look, at the Human Rights Council, well, what I say is the Foreign Affairs Department of any government is their marketing department. And that unfortunately seeps into the United Nations. There's an effort really to say you're doing everything fine and not wanting to receive criticism and critique. Outside of those more formal spaces are where there is some admission of challenges, including to me. I recently had a government ask for advice on whether, on their policing regime, and I sent them like a 12-page document on the options they had available to them. So kind of outside the formal spaces, that's where the real work actually takes place. But it's a bit trite to say the defense against torture by a state also reinforces how important the torture prohibition is. So the more that one objects, that they don't accept torture. They may know they're doing it, but really they don't want to be accused of it.
Yes.
And we need to kind of leverage that.
Reputational damage in a way that
huge.
Violating violating other mandates, violating the rights protected by other mandates doesn't necessarily. And actually, just on that, we have worked together, or I've made submissions to you. We've collaborated on a number of cases over the years, including of journalists and activists and writers and protesters, peaceful protesters who've been imprisoned, detained, at risk of torture, placed in prolonged solitary confinement, or survivors of torture. And just giving one example of that, Alice, I know you're restricted in what you can say about individual cases, but one individual example of that is an Irishman, Yasser El-Jabouri, who was detained in Iraq, was tortured in Iraq, and his family, his wife Laura, went public about that very quickly. There was a very real and imminent risk. And you and I have worked on many of those cases over the last number of years, some of which are never in the headlines. No one ever knows about them. And something which I think people don't necessarily appreciate is often behind the scenes being able to say to the country, if it comes out that you are using torture in this case, it's going to be very bad for you. And I have seen that secure people's freedom. And I've seen your work secure people's freedoms. There are people who are free today, including someone I spoke to this morning, only because of work you've done behind the scenes, which no one will ever know about. So I wanted to ask you about that, about the reputational risk issue and how that can be used as leverage to secure freedom and to get someone free from torture, even if they're not stories which people ever hear the full details of.
I mean, there are so many cases that come to the mandate, and I have to be honest, many are never taken up, and that is just heartbreaking. Yeah. We've had a wonderful relationship and arrangement around the cases. My priority is always the victim or the survivor, and also working with their families and or their lawyers. They will know best when and how I should call a government out. I think the name and shame approach of international advocacy is overused. And what I mean by that is it's used automatically and it needs to be used strategically. So quite often I will have conversations with lawyers about, well, I'm prepared to go public, but have you put pressure yet on the government and warned them that I'm about to go public? And we've had cases where within the 7 days where I've said I'm waiting 7 days for the person to be released, the person has been released because the government doesn't want my press release to go out, and then the press release doesn't go out. Yeah. It's not about me or making the headlines, it's making sure that the people are out of detention. And I think a lot more work can be done about kind of educating others in the human rights advocacy space about when you use the public appeals, and we've also had cases where there is always a risk that when you go public, the person will be tortured worse. Yeah. And that is a huge burden to carry. So it's making sure you've checked with everybody that you've done all the options available. And at times, yes, one needs to go public and one needs to go public often. There are also consequences, as you know and I know, on ourselves. There's a certain country of which they've accused me of obstruction of justice and contempt of court. I assume if I step into their country or transit over their country and have to land, I may well be arrested.
Or go to a country which has an extradition arrangement with them.
Yes,
makes your travel
exactly. Yes, my travel, and also as I'm coming to the end, there are certain countries now that are off my my list, and I've heard you speak about this before, Keelan, too. So there
Dublin is fine. We're okay here.
We're okay. Fingers crossed. I'll tell you I get out safely. No, of course. But we were talking about kind of when to go public and how to strategize. I think it's really important, but that takes a lot of time, and I think that's one of the real personal struggles I've had is how many people are not well represented, who write to the mandate. There are handwritten letters from prisoners that are just piled up. The office doesn't have the capacity either to open them. So when we say the mandate needs more funding, and I don't want to put it out there as competitive with other mandates, but honestly, the reason I got the Swiss JPO is because I could show that the amount of cases I dealt with were 4 times any other mandate. And now, of course, because we haven't had that continuous support they've gone down a lot.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of people that really need this support and help and don't get it.
So a huge backlog. And also, you think about that, there's a handwritten letter which has come from a prisoner who's detained, in a particular country, victim of torture, and is writing to you as a last resort. And it may be a letter which is never opened because there aren't the resources to ever do that. It's astonishing, really. Okay.
And very serious.
It is extremely
that responsibility of the human rights system to be there for victims and survivors and to take their cases up, and not being able to deal with the case. And of course, once one deals with the case, it doesn't go away immediately, right? Like, it can be several years. I've been working on some cases for several years. And of course, as you know, some of the cases have had lethal ends. And that is also incredibly difficult to deal with, that you've intervened in cases and people have been killed. So, the consequences, and that's why I think the strategy is so incredibly important. It's really, you do the best you can to know what you're doing and why you're taking certain steps, and not being kind of just automatic about the approaches one takes.
Yeah, and I think we've both seen that when it works, and we've both also seen when it doesn't work. But really important to say that the stories that people see are the ones necessarily where an assessment's been made that it's shout from the rooftops time, essentially. And there are many, many cases which are never seen, and for very good strategic reason are never seen, where actually quite often the dagger on the wall in Act 1 can have much more impact than actually using the dagger in Act 2, for example. I've seen that in many real life examples. Okay, so I wanted to give another kind of broad question, if I may. I mentioned Yasser al-Jabouri. Many Irish people have of course been detained essentially as hostages, as pawns to make a geopolitical point, because it's worthwhile to hold a European Union citizen, for example. And we've seen that happen with many other nationalities. So someone like the US journalist Evan Gershkovich being held by Russia, or someone like the British nationals like Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and others who were held by Iran because of a fight between Iran and the UK, for example. Now that's a topic, hostage taking as an aspect of torture, which you did a superb report on in the last year. One of the things I mentioned at the start as being really transformative. Could you reflect on that as a trend and tell us anything you've observed about hostage taking as a trend?
So I think there are two types of hostage taking. One, terrorist or armed group hostage taking. That can be individuals, or it can also be large groups. The Boko Haram and others in Nigeria, the hostages taken by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups into Gaza. But of course, back in the day, Colombia, there were 21,000 people who were taken hostage during those events. I think on that side, it continues to be a tool of armed groups and terrorists across the Sahel in Africa, for military leverage, for political leverage, and financial leverage. And that requires a different global response. And then on the other side, there are individuals who are being taken by specific governments who seem to be using this as part of their diplomatic strategy to get attention or to get payments back, etc. And I'm working on half a dozen cases at the moment, from the Formans, this British travelling couple who had permission to enter and were with a licensed guide, and they've been convicted to 10 years for espionage and are sitting in this notorious Evan prison where Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was also held. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, the Australian, who was held for 2 years because she'd been invited to a conference, and she's a Middle East expert.
Many of my clients who were journalists, but also one who just worked for the British Council, did cultural rights work.
Yes.
So a huge number of people.
There are a huge number of people, and they also straddle business. So what's been interesting too is this dimension of business people being held for debts owed by their companies. And sometimes those companies may be a state company. So it's not business as we imagine it, between private companies and trying to go to court and etc. But between a state over here and a state here, and this state is owed the debt, or the contract collapses, and they hold the director.
And Alice, of course, Ireland has seen that with an example of an Irishman held in China for an extended period of time for essentially that reason. So it's seen exactly that kind of commercial debt dispute issue. Yeah.
And so the report I wrote to the Human Rights Council canvasses all of that. One of the great achievements of that was last year, for the first time, the General Assembly in their triennial resolution on torture said that to prevent torture, you also need to prevent hostage taking. And they encouraged the ratification of the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages, a 1979 instrument, which interestingly has one additional state party than the Convention Against Torture, but it's been a totally neglected treaty. There are quite a lot of human rights treaties that are kind of, unless they've got a treaty body, they are kind of left in the wings. So the resurrection of that treaty, I think, is really important, and the recognition that not only for the hostage themselves and the terrible ordeals that they go through, but also for their family members, who literally can become overnight campaigners for the return of their family members, who have to give up their jobs, etc., to be able to do that full time. I think this is one of the areas that continues to need more attention. And what I've been asking national governments to do is they need a special envoy on hostage taking and or wrongful detentions, which the United States and Canada do very well. And the United Nations itself has no one responsible for hostages, that it's in their title. So actually, I've asked for a special representative. That won't happen within the current setup, but there will be a new Secretary General soon. And I think it's an increasing phenomenon, an increasingly brazen phenomenon.
And particularly important, I think, for small states as well, because, of course, the US, as you mentioned, has that special envoy role. Only came out of a period when they didn't have anything like that, and really superb work done by people like Diane Foley after her son Jim was killed, and Jason Rezaian at the Washington Post, who saw what was needed to secure freedom. Of course, when you have someone who's taken from Ireland or Malta or another small European country, it would be much more valuable if you were able to say you've got the whole weight of the European Union behind you, because actually Malta might not necessarily have very much leverage with the detaining country, but Germany may have, for example. So there's a lot more work to be done in this space. But I really think the work that you have done in the mandate has been of critical importance. And thank you for all the work you've done on that. I was going to ask you about looking back on your 4 years, one highlight and one lowlight from the role. I mean, that's certainly one highlight for me, the achievement on hostage taking. What would you say is, if you had to pick one highlight and one lowlight, what would they be?
So I think for me, all the work I've been doing with victims and survivors over the last 3.5 years, I've held what we called hearings for healing with victims and survivors in Colombia, in Nepal, and in Kenya. They were regional hearings. The survivors actually nominated themselves. They asked to participate and they had to kind of apply, and they were supported by a support person, an NGO, their therapist, a psychologist, etc. And for some of them, it was their first ever engagement with someone in an official position, and it was the first time someone actually listened to what they had to say, and that was incredibly powerful. Now, these survivors have launched the Charter of Rights for Victims and Survivors of Torture, which I put into my report itself. So it's within a UN doc number, which sounds very theoretical, but incredibly important for its continuation. And that has...
And it's a landmark, really, the Charter. It's so important.
It's a really...
Shaped by victims and survivors themselves.
Yeah, and please take the time to read it, because it really reads from their heart. It's not a policy document. Okay, they've got very specific demands. They know what they want. And some of those things they want are repeats of the rights they already have but haven't been able to exercise. I think what was very central about those hearings was this kind of, people came from different walks of life. You had the young girl who had been raped in her village and over on multiple occasions. You had a couple of young men who'd been shot in protests in the eye and were blinded. One of them was a photographer. So his career also was affected by this. And then you had long-standing advocates who for 30 years had been fighting for their rights in Chile, etc. So there was a very, unique group of people, each with their own individual stories, that came together. We had the Indian survivor sitting next to the Pakistani survivor by the end of the session. Like people really realizing that torture can affect anybody, that they are together in kind of their fight. And at least one of them said, I thought I was alone. I didn't know, which is terrible. I didn't know how widespread it was, because they're so isolated in kind of what they're told. They're told to be quiet. Then after one is tortured, there's the whole consequence of that in terms of societal shame, etc. So that, for me, the Charter of Rights, Victims and Survivors, and tomorrow is the International Day for Victims of Torture. And I'm
of June.
Pleased to say that 30 of my fellow special rapporteurs and 6 working groups have all signed a statement endorsing the Charter and say they will apply it in their own work. And I think survivors will be really happy to hear that. And the Committee Against Torture and the Subcommittee and the United Nations Fund for Victims of Torture have also, we put out a joint statement together as well. They are also endorsing it.
And Alice, for the 26th of June, and given that you've mentioned that charter, so people have it, it's Charter of Rights of Victims and Survivors of Torture and Other Cruelty, and do take a look at it. What would you ask Ireland and other states to do in relation to the charter? Have you an ask for them?
Yes, the Charter speaks directly to states. And it also actually speaks to international organisations, which makes it quite unique, and to civil society. So they have demands, they feel ignored, and they don't always feel like they're being made central. But one of their big asks is that they must participate in decisions that are affecting them. And I think now what needs to happen is for governments to review how they approach victims and survivors and cross-check it with what survivors say they need. And of course, this has been, there've been a lot of good efforts in this domain over the years, but quite often it's, let's bring in a survivor. Sometimes the survivor gets scripted, sometimes, and then that's it, or it's a tick the box exercise. No, these survivors want to be known for their expertise, which is their lived experience. They want to be hired as researchers and trainers and experts, and they really want to be able to shape the next phase so that, and in their words, no one else will have to suffer what they have suffered.
Absolutely.
But you said one low light.
Yes, I did. I was just going to ask you.
So, okay.
Sorry, in case you're not depressed enough.
I mean, the highlights, I have others
as
well, of course. But, one of the things I've struggled most with on the country visits, as important as they are, and the ability to meet with all the relevant stakeholders and try and encourage governments to do better, and by putting a microscope over what they've been doing so far, is overcrowding in prisons is a global phenomenon. And I still have images in my head of all the different prisons I've visited, including before being Special Rapporteur on Torture. But I remember being 2 images. I have one in Senegal in a long room. The director admitted they were 140% oversubscribed. The government admits they're oversubscribed. The whole system is kind of at a bottleneck with not enough lawyers, etc., and the criminal justice system operating very... So we're standing there, we're kind of measuring the room, how many people are sleeping here, etc. Only 2 bunks, but they're all joined, so it's a single bed going along, top to tail. The directors knew that it was so overcrowded, they let the doors open all day long because they knew people had to get out into the courtyard, because some people had to catch up on sleep because they didn't have anywhere to sleep. And as we were chatting to some of the prisoners, one of them lifted up the sheet and said, Madame, you have to see, underneath, in the cavern underneath the bunks, were other young men, top to tail. Yeah. And this level of, the government admitted this was a problem. They were a new government. They'd only been in for a year. Both the president and prime minister had both been detained during the election period, so they were making it part of their campaign. But I've also been in prisons in Chile where the bunks are 5 high, and the person at the top of the bunk is the youngest, but you're in a in a room with 70 prisoners, and they've put the sheets over the edge, so the guards can't see in at night. You don't know what's going on in there, and you could not turn over in the bed with 1 or 2 toilets for 70 men. So we forget sometimes about prisons, and actually I didn't really think I would do a report on prisons during my mandate, but also I had so many states writing to me in relation to the individual cases, and either purposefully or not understanding, like reinterpreting the Nelson Mandela rules to suit what was going on. And I was like, how often is this happening? That even on solitary confinement, they were reinterpreting it. Oh, but the person asked for a private room. That's not, doesn't get you around solitary confinement.
No, exactly. And there's happened to my client, Jimmy Lai, who you've done so much work with.
Yes. So yeah, so I think the images of those terrible places, you know, where you just, you know, despite, you know, a criminal justice system needing to have penalties, this is such inhumane treatment.
It's quite the low light. I know you've seen this a lot too. I've had a client who just got out of prison in the last few weeks in Kuwait, and who, because the prison was so overcrowded, he was put with a huge number of other people who were all rounded up because their reporting wasn't liked, and they were put in a corridor. So they were sleeping in those kind of conditions in a corridor under a fluorescent light, non-stop, no darkness at any hour of the day or night, fluorescent light in baking hot heat. And this is something you've seen time and again over these 4 years. Turning to another rather difficult topic, and I'm conscious of the time, but there's a few other topics I just want to cover before we do Q&A. Alice, you've obviously written very extensively on torture in armed conflict and done incredible work in relation to that. And I'm conscious that many in the audience will be very aware of particular concerns regarding Gaza and some of the recent coverage here. What has been your approach in the mandate to dealing with heavily politicized conflicts like Gaza and Israel, for example?
Yeah, it's a really important question in this era we're in, because almost everything is becoming politicized, given that we're in this very divisive world, and also social media portraying things and sending us algorithms. So one person receives certain information, another receives other, and then they're not receiving the same view of what is there.
And you're at the eye of the storm, really, because on something like that, you're presumably receiving complaints from all sides simultaneously, with supporting evidence and so on, and you're the decision maker, given those various hats you described earlier.
Yeah, so the approach I've taken is that it's the same to everything I've done, is that every victim counts. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum it is. It doesn't matter if it's a president. It doesn't matter if it's the street sweeper. It doesn't matter their political views. Torture applies to everyone. The prohibition on torture applies to everyone equally. And that has been, you know, that's been complicated because sometimes you can't get the information you need. There are many countries now, including, you know, lack of access to Gaza to be able to interview people and to get a full scope of what's going on. But, you know, I think one of the things we are not able to, seem to be less able to do these days, is two things can be true at the same time. So it can be true that, that the 7th of October for Israelis was a traumatic event the size of and larger than 9/11 in the United States, that many people were killed, 1,200 people were killed, mostly civilians, and 251 people of 25 plus nationalities were taken into Gaza. It's true that that can be a traumatic event. And on the other hand, it's also the devastation and destruction that we see going on in Gaza and the response that is causing people enormous pain and suffering, very high numbers of people being killed, lots of cases of torture that are coming out, both by Israel inside Israeli detention facilities, and also now we have information about the extent that we knew, but we didn't have all the data about Hamas and other groups. the Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territories just reported that something like 297 cases of killings by Hamas in the last year of fellow Palestinians. So all those things can be true at the same time. And I think my role has been to collect the evidence as best as possible and to present that evidence in the most objective and neutral manner that I can. And it hasn't been easy, but I mean, I kind of say to myself, you know, you can only walk your own line of integrity and do the best that you can with the circumstances that you have. And also, I think it's really important that, you know, while, and, you know, I stand by my record, I've put 2 very comprehensive letters of allegations to the Israeli government, and I've signed on to about 6 others, including from the death penalty, the recent death penalty, to other changes in the law, etc. But I'm not signing on to things that aren't in my mandate. So I'm not making comments about things that I don't have the expertise in or that fall outside that scope. And that's the same approach I apply across the board. So yes, that's kind of the approach. And, you know, I also did a visit in December 2024 to Israel and Palestine, met with some parts of the Israeli government, met with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. I've been doing a bit of shuttle diplomacy, also not heard from behind the scenes. And every time you go from one side, you're taking the allegations of the other side, getting an update, of course, on what they think the scenario is, and then putting those allegations, and you go back and forth. And it's preoccupied, and rightly so, a lot of the international attention. I also worry about the conflicts that are, you know, on the back burner. Yemen, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I have a letter of allegation of terrible sexual violence that's been going on. I spent a year of my life in Gisenyi on the Goma-Gisenyi border, so I know that zone and I know that region well. Sudan, I've worked with others on these other conflicts. Syria, I put in a submission to the ICJ case where I took all of my predecessors' work from 2011 onwards, which was, you know, and compiled all the allegations we ever had. You know, Venezuela, there were 120 submissions to Venezuela since Maduro came to power. I mean, there is a lot of work being generated by the special procedure, and I think sometimes the more power comes when we actually look backwards and kind of look at it over time. Yeah. And I think even if one doesn't have a result from that, the government doesn't reply, or the government's reply is bureaucratic at best, kind of, or denials. Sometimes they're not only denials, they will actually give you some good statistics or other information. But, you know, sometimes people ask me, why do you keep, you know, documenting if governments aren't replying? And I think the point is, at some point in time, we hope that justice and reconciliation and peace will prevail, and all of that material will be useful in those later either justice, you know, accountability, criminal measures, or in
shining a spotlight in itself.
Yes. Also, yes.
I'm acutely conscious of the time.
Yes.
Just before we turn to Q&A, I want to ask you one thing about Ireland specifically. Some people in the audience will know that in February of this year, you and another of the UN Special Rapporteurs, Gina Romero, expressed particular concern over the acquisition and use of less lethal weapons, and that phrase, for crowd control and protest management by the Gardaí, noting that it carries serious risks of human rights violations, including the absolute prohibition of torture. Could you tell us a little about that? So what were the weapons and what was the issue? Can you tell us a little about that in about 2 to 3 minutes, if possible, and then we'll do Q&A.
Yeah, so I'm often hand in glove with the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association, and the Jardia here had purchased for the first time tasers, which is fine. Tasers are permissible as a law enforcement weapon, but they, for the first time, purchased tasers that were over the normal voltage of ordinary tasers. So that will therefore cause more damage to individuals, and we wanted to check that they were properly trained, etc. So we transmitted a submission to the Irish government.
So sorry, first time the Gardaí get tasers, they get superpower ones, yes. Essentially. Is that
yes.
very simplistic?
Yes,
that's the
yes.
Okay.
And the reply that they did reply, And they're not wrong to say, well, there aren't any real international standards on the voltage, which is true. And even my own report on torture-free trade, we also don't have proper standards on what chemicals you can use for chemical weapons. There are some gaps, and I've been pushing for a torture-free trade and use treaty. But that's not an excuse to suddenly not do what the ordinary is. And I think governments have to be very careful about this industry, which is growing, and an enormous industry trying to sell these weapons and to, new technologies, etc. So I don't think they're going to decommission them, but I think it's a worry because they're out of sync also with European Union countries. So it's potentially a conversation also for the EU.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.